Everyone. It is my honor to be the host for the ops section group conversation today. The slides are in the doc, and I see some questions coming in. I'll just cover my highlights briefly. So I kind of organize them as just general notes, accomplishments, and future plans. We're starting to get to full staffing on all of the teams, which is awesome. The system group was kind of one of the last remaining ones, so excited to see that. The engineering organization, the development organization has started to organize this advisory group, which I think is really interesting. There's a lot of kind of complex architectural questions in the ops section that I'm excited that that group is kind of getting together. And at present, it's a Slack channel. I think they had their first meeting today. So if you have some questions about that, they might be able to share. But I'm excited about that group forming. And then we've consistently said dog fooding was really important in the ops section, and I've seen a lot of great engagement. Hat tip to Devin and Tristan, who I think is either recently done or is about to do some like shadowing of the SRE team. Tristan is on the development team, and then Devin, who's been spearheading the dog fooding efforts of using auto DevOps on a couple of small projects within the GitLab SRE and infrastructure teams. So awesome to see that kind of like great collaboration between the two teams. Accomplishments, there's kind of a theme to both accomplishments and future plans. I'm really excited about seeing our kind of using of the GitLab primitives around primitives around source control management in things like infrastructure as code, defining your dashboards in code, the moving of how we manage and deploy GitLab managed apps into your cluster into kind of in code using CI. So kind of building more connections between the configure and monitor stages and the primitives that we have in other stages that are more commonly used by our users. Really cool to see that. I think it will also accelerate some of our adoption and dog fooding efforts and encourage more users of these two stages of the product. Yeah, those were my general highlights. Let's jump to questions. Please add questions to the doc. First up, David.
Yeah, so the first question I put in there is, what are some of the challenges, or at least major challenges you see over the next several months to get to your next maturity level?
Cool. And I will ask the individual product managers who are on the call to jump in. I think I'm pulling up where we have that listed. So if you go to slide 13, there is a link to achieve 100% category maturity. And that link I'll put here has the current planned maturity increments. So Sarah is not available, but Dove, I don't know if you're on, if you would care to share the planned improvements for getting logging to viable.
I don't think Dove is on the call either.
Oh, bummer. Okay. So Victor, maybe you can review the serverless getting to viable plan.
Yeah. So I wouldn't say that we have any major challenges by now, which is pretty good news. Basically, we are currently working on providing automatic domains and SSL for every new deployment that goes to Knative. And besides this, we have just minor things to add, which really just enhance the developer experience when somebody would like to build something for Knative. And we are pretty much on track with this.
And then Daniel, I know you've been scheduling the chaos engineering MVC. You want to highlight that? I know that's not a complex plan, it's a single issue, but.
Yeah, sure. So we previously had a plan to use this open source project called KubeMonkey, and that was kind of analogous to Chaos Monkey, which is made popular by Netflix. And we had one, not problem, but one limitation there, that it only allowed us to do one kind of chaos experiment, which was killing pods. So we kind of hesitated to use that, and very recently we came across a project called Litmus Chaos that allows us to do kind of a wide range of experiments in a Kubernetes native way. So we feel good kind of moving forward with that. And we have planned to do kind of a minimal implementation of that in 12.7, which will allow users to install that in their cluster and then kind of run those experiments manually. And then long term, what we would like to do is kind of fold this into auto DevOps and then allow users to indicate if they want to do some chaos engineering in their project with a variable, just saying yes, opt in. And then longer term, even more longer term, we would like to provide you with a dashboard with some insights about the results of the experiments that you've done, and what kind of things you could do kind of to harden your application or your infrastructure, things like that. So that's kind of the plan for chaos.
One of the other maturity increments we have is error tracking. And as I mentioned, the product manager for the health team, which is covering error tracking, is out of office this week, but I can speak to I've been covering for some of the release post process this week. There's a number of features related to error tracking viability going in this release. I think at this point, we're so close to the end of the quarter and the team feels like they're on track for these increments that there aren't a whole bunch of unknowns. I will share, in the spirit of your question, David, we'd originally, I think at the start of this quarter, had tracing getting to viable in this release. And we, in the process of doing some validation track exercises, product discovery, realized that there was a lot more effort and question marks around our embedding of Jaeger. We recently kind of improved our embedding of the Jaeger UI, but the APIs aren't great for building the level of interaction that we're building in error tracking for tracing. And so that was actually a case where we pushed out a maturity increment because we're trying to get more validation of the problem.
Yeah, Amy, thank you for the insight. The kind of the goal of the question, and everybody answered, is, for at least secure and defend, we're struggling with what you build yourself versus what you leverage open source for. As we begin to scope some of the larger projects, we start realizing there's gaps in other parts of the portfolio that's causing us then to work with somebody else to round something out so we can do what we want to do. And it sounds like, for the most part, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like everything's kind of firing on all cylinders for ops right now and getting to the next goals you have set. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I think Daniel's example, though, shows a case where we'd thought about using one technology and had to switch. The Jaeger one is another example. So we are relying on and trying to rely on other open source technologies, but there are times where we have to pivot quickly. So,
okay. The next question is also mine. So some parts of the monitor direction align nicely with other sections, and I'll use myself as the example here. Defend initially wanted to have a lot of central logging for security events, and then outside of these types of calls, I've talked to Kenny about that in the past, about how Defend could do that. The question I have is, for the monitor team, what do you see as the best way to collaborate? Is it direct contribution from the development teams in those other sections, rounding features out that they need? Or do you want to see that as more indirect and have product requirements written that the monitor team can then put into the backlog and prioritize?
Oh, I would always opt for direct. I understand that the Defend team also has limited bandwidth, and we're certainly interested in seeing in encouraging more adoption of the entire part of the product. But the natural result, or the natural response, is direct. Like, feel free. There's no code ownership here. Contribute to wherever helps improve the product. I would suggest that I think there are probably some product related, or maybe we can think of them as more UX related conversations to be had around. I'm starting to see this pop up where there's an entity in our model between an issue and a to-do, kind of. So I think of things like when we spot a vulnerability in Secure or similar in Defend, we have a similar concept we're thinking about in terms of errors or alerts in the monitor world, that maybe we can think of a smart, small primitive that would be useful across all of those use cases as something that is a little bit ephemeral, not quite as robust as an issue, but typically it comes at high volume, like you see with vulnerabilities and alerts. So there might be some of those that are outside of just direct engineering investment, where we need to think more through the user, some sort of more unified user experience.
Thank you. I guess we can pass it on to Brandon.
Yeah.
Yep. Question was just curious, talked a bit about all the work with Knative. Thoughts on how that fits into customers, for example, they're coming at serverless from a Lambda direction.
Yeah. If you don't mind, Kenny, I will
Go for it.
take.
First.
Okay, so as I already wrote in the docs, clearly Lambda is the market leader here with this huge market share actually, and definitely have to take this into account. Actually, for this reason, we're actively interviewing Lambda users in order to understand the whole serverless ecosystem in general, what's important for serverless, how can we create a much better Knative experience. Actually, so this is one thing how we think about Lambda users. But the other thing is as well that simply we would like to improve the Lambda user experience, which is quite tricky because if you think of it, it's not really related to the system group because for the system, it's outside of you. So we are still looking into it, and we created a few project templates last month to make it very easy to get started. We have another issue where we would like to see if we can get CloudWatch logs into GitLab, actually. So we could use GitLab for Lambda monitoring. But Lambda is kind of a second-order citizen in the system group, even though they have huge market share. It's more of a use case that we look at them at.
Would you mind sharing those, the templates and stuff? We just would be also anything good. We can also make sure Amazon knows. That'd be awesome. But and long term, do we feel like this shifts at all? I mean, I know we've made a big bet on Knative for obvious reasons, but do we see that shifting? Is just we don't have the systems insight that obviously we can with Knative. So I get them being quite different.
Yes, they are quite different by nature, basically. On the other hand, there are a few projects right now in the open source community which try to create runners that are identical to AWS Lambda runners. In this way, it might be easier for someone who would like to move away from Lambda to have it done. But actually, the real problematic around serverless is that it's not just the serverless functionality that you provide, but the whole ecosystem around that.
Yeah, I think one way that Victor and I have talked about framing the distinction is, in our configure group, we talk about enabling the utilization of different types of infrastructure, typically Kubernetes, and that's how we've fallen to rely on Knative. But serverless, and specifically serverless Lambda, is more what we would call an application type. And there are ways that we can improve the use case for that application type that feel unrelated to the typical work that the configure stage does, but is still important to driving, the adoption of GitLab and the usefulness of GitLab for Lambda use cases. So Brandon, I don't know if that term resonates with you, but we talk about application types as things like web apps or static sites or other things. And serverless is, with Lambda at least, is more about enabling that application type than some other infrastructure primitives that we might do with things like Knative, where we are installing it for you and getting it set up.
Yep. Yeah, no, makes perfect sense in terms of how we think of it. So I think framing it from the outside will be real useful for people coming at it, because there will be people that want ubiquitous Lambda and AWS and Lambda capabilities elsewhere. There's going to be people that want Knative in both. And then there's a very large number that literally come at it as serverless equals Lambda. And in some ways, like, they made that choice, so we don't really need to confuse them. We're just like, great, here's how we help you.
Cool. And Victor, I know that you have a issue where you kind of describe the distinction between the two. It might be helpful to add that link.
Yeah, I will try to look it up. Just a side note, Brendan, here is that on the long run, I think we would love to get to a point where we can help the users to seamlessly start using Knative as well, but it's definitely on the very long run because it's not an obvious thing for obvious reasons.
I'll commit it for next quarter to someone.
Thank you for your patience.
Cool. Simon, you have the next question.
Yeah, so I've just recently had a discussion with a customer who was sort of complaining a bit that we don't necessarily have any official best practices when deploying infrastructure as code with our CI/CD pipelines, specifically with regards to Lambda, and they're actually using SAM to deploy to Lambda. So they were just trying to figure out if there's anything like best practice-y or any examples that we have that might be relevant to them.
Victor, these are right in your alley.
Yeah, I can't write my answers so quickly into the doc.
Feel free to vocalize.
Okay, that's definitely true that we don't have best practices, as it was just told before. One of the reasons for this is that Lambda is actually an application type and not really the core focus of us. But we've added some docs to Lambda deployments a few months ago by Nicholas Pick. Actually, he even wrote this already, and I think he right now linked it as well. So this is just basically CI/CD template usage, so nothing special there. If you're asking in general about infrastructure as code, not just Lambda and SAM, that's a bit of a different topic. We are currently started to work on infrastructure as code, but more specifically there on Terraform, and more features will come there in the next quarter or next 2 quarters, actually.
Yeah, I think this customer was specifically asking about Lambda and SAM, but honestly, I get the same questions from other people using Terraform and those tools as well. So
for Terraform, we provide much better support. And if you would be so nice and bring those customers to me for a customer interview, I would be really happy to talk with them and learn about them even more. Yeah, so this definitely goes for Terraform. And for Lambda and SAM, we don't plan on adding more support for SAM. So what I can recommend is that just look at that docs, and it should be fairly simple to create a GitLab CI YAML for SAM as well.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
And Simon, I'll share, I think it was a product group conversation where some other team members asked about, like, is there an equivalent for GitLab Flow for infrastructure as code? And I think part of Victor's validation effort that he's described is understanding if there is a common pattern and how we better support it and whether or not we should recommend it. I think the industry as a whole is asking questions about what's the appropriate CI workflow with infrastructure as code, and it would behoove us to be opinionated there, but I don't think we have the information to suggest a like definitive way. I think you talked to 10 different customers, you'd hear at least 3 different best practices for managing infrastructure as code.
Victor, I will get you a link, but the WAG talk that we gave at reInvent was with GitLab and Terraform, and the questions at the end are literally probably 10 or 12 straight questions around how to use Terraform and GitLab. So I'll get you that link so you can just listen to the video, but you'll get a bunch of interesting use cases right there.
That would be perfect for me as well. Thank you.
Yep.
Cool. Dan Gordon, you're up.
Great, thanks. So I think this might be a more general engineering question, but just following off of the first question, where we said we were looking at a technology, it didn't have what we wanted in it, and so we moved on and we're looking for another technology or product. How do we make that determination of looking for, moving on and looking for the new tool to integrate in versus adding to it what we need, maybe it's API level or whatever, and then contributing that back?
That's a great question. I don't know if I have a direct answer, but I feel like we should probably write down whatever our current evaluation criteria is in the handbook. Examples in the past, we look at size and makeup of the community, right? So if the community is typically solely driven by a singular corporate entity that doesn't like have a lot of direction, that's a completely different story than something that it's like a CNCF project that has a bunch of corporately diverse contributors. But Daniel, I don't know if you can share a specific example from that evaluation of KubeMonkey, but I don't know what the process was.
It's a great question, and I think it's nuanced. I think that there's a couple of things. So I think as a company, we're cloud native first. So we kind of look for products that align to that ethos, if you will. And second, I think that we try to make contact with the community and the maintainers of those projects and make sure that kind of the values and the direction align with our own open source and things like that. So in the case of Litmus, for example, this is a team that has submitted their project to the CNCF, and they kind of share our thinking of open source and align to our values very, very well. So I would say that one side of it is technology, and the other side of it, it's community. And of course, we want something that has traction and that solves real problems, right? So yeah, I think it's worth, as a follow-up, putting something together for us that kind of captures that sentiment. But I would say that that's it at a high level.
I'm going to take this opportunity. If I were, I'm going to write this MR of kind of like what our process would be, but I would want Brandon's input. Brandon, you have a ton of experience here. How would you suggest we evaluate those decisions? Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, it's good. I'd want to think about it a little bit, but I mean, yeah, let me get back to you.
Okay.
I don't want to.
I'll propose the MR and then I'll ping you on it.
Yes, I'd love to.
Cool.
I'd love to put I'll put plenty of feedback.
Awesome.
That's a
Dan,
great question, Dan. Thank you.
Yeah, it is a great one. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for discussing it. So the next one is around just kind of the multi-cloud. What are our plans going forward to be competitive as a multi-cloud provider? Because that's one of the things that we're going out with that's unique about us. We're differentiated. We're not tied to Amazon, so you don't use code pipeline, etc. But tools like GitHub Actions, Azure DevOps, and a lot of the competition have plugins, if you will, that make it very easy from the pipeline to connect in to the different cloud providers. We've made it easy to work with EKS and GKE, but there's a lot more that we need to be able to show to be competitive there. So what is our thinking around that and the prioritization of that? Yeah,
it's really another interesting question. Thank you, Dan. I would maybe start with, and I'm willing to accept challenges on this one, that a choice of a tool like Terraform is an answer to that, right? If we support Terraform, Terraform is by its nature has those integrations and plugins available. So more native support for Terraform in our CI would enable that multi-cloud without us having to build those primitives specifically for each cloud provider in our like CI, YAML, whatever, DSL. I don't know if that's a great answer, to be honest. It is not, feels like a little bit of a cop-out because it's so easy, but I don't know if it solves what you're looking for.
Well, the question I would ask following that then is like, how do we differentiate that, right? If multi-cloud is going to be a differentiator for us, and maybe that's the thing to be challenged, then doing Terraform is good, but we have to do something more to differentiate our use of Terraform.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we think about, and Victor spoke about this earlier, when we think about infrastructure as code, it's not just like, do we support it, but how do we make that workflow easier for the practitioners who are doing that, who are using infrastructure as code? And that involves not just in configure stage features that make the workflow easier and kind of more empower the person defining that infrastructure, but also making connections between other stages where there's other information that might make that experience better. I'm trying to blank on some exact examples, but you can think of utilizing information from the fact that we know the plan and development and incident management portions of a user's journey and supplanting that in the infrastructure as code parts to make their lives easier. Like that would be a place where we could differentiate over someone like GitHub, beyond just using Terraform for infrastructure as code simpler on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I would add to that integration with tools like Crossplane is something that like nobody out there is doing that today, right? And that allows you to kind of provision resources in any cloud in a Kubernetes native way. That's one of the ways that we differentiate. I think that cluster creation is another, as you pointed out, and we have plans to do that with other providers in the future. But I think that doing things that are cloud specific is a slippery slope, right? If we start to do like plugins for one cloud, and having to maintain them or open sourcing to the community. And I think that kind of, I don't know, it grows beyond manageable, valuable, and maintainable state very quickly, as we've seen in the market prior. So I think that we want to add value there in more generic ways. I wouldn't say that we want to do anything beyond cluster creation that is specific to a single cloud.
Great point. Thank you, Daniel. We're out of time, which I'm loath because, Lucas, I would love to answer your question. I'm going to copy it into the ops section channel and ping you, and we can continue the discussion there. It's a great question, Lucas. Thank you all. Reminder, my quote unquote Easter egg was that today is International Human Rights Day. There's some links for how you can celebrate on slide 30. Check them out. Thanks, everybody. Have a great one.